My daughter called to discuss my options 3 days after we buried my husband. She didn't know I had already made my choice, and that the small stone cottage in Tuscany her father left me in secret had been sitting empty, waiting for exactly this moment. I want you to follow this story until the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. It was a Tuesday when everything changed, the kind of gray November Tuesday that feels apologetic, like the sky itself is embarrassed to be so ordinary after something so large has happened. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a single coffee cup, just one now, not two, when my phone rang. My daughter. I dried my hands on the dish towel my husband had embroidered with a lopsided sunflower at a craft class he'd refused to admit he enjoyed. And I answered, "Mom, we need to get together this week." Her voice carried that particular efficiency she'd developed over the years, the one she used when closing real estate deals. "It's important." I told her I was still tired from the service. She told me she understood, which was how I knew she didn't. My daughter had never been good at sitting inside difficult feelings. She preferred to move through them, organize them, schedule them away. "We're just worried," she said. "My son-in-law and I, about your situation." My situation. As if grief were a plumbing problem that needed a licensed professional. I told her I'd call her Thursday. What I didn't tell her was that Thursday I planned to drive 40 minutes to the law office of a woman my husband had met with quietly, twice a year, for the past 6 years. My husband had been a man of few dramatic gestures. He fixed things before they broke. He planned for weather you couldn't yet see on the horizon. In 38 years of marriage, I had learned to trust the quiet way he moved through the world, always 3 steps ahead, never announcing it. So when I found the letter tucked inside his favorite book, a worn paperback copy of Steinbeck, he kept on the nightstand. I wasn't entirely surprised. I was undone, but I wasn't surprised. It was sealed with a strip of tape, my name written on the front in his careful handwriting. I sat on the edge of our bed, or what had been our bed, and I held it for a long time before I opened it. "My darling Ruth, if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead without you, which is the one thing I spent the last decade dreading most. I want you to know 3 things before you read anything else. 1. You are going to be all right. 2. I made sure of it. 3. The key to the cottage is in the tin box on the 3rd shelf of my workshop, behind the jar of finishing nails. It's labeled Florence Hardware, 1987. You'll recognize the key because it has a green tag. Go to that workshop before you do anything else." I did exactly that. I pulled on my coat over my pajamas, walked through the cold garage, and opened the door to the workshop that still smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. The tin box was exactly where he said it would be. The key had a green tag, and underneath the key was a folded document, a property deed, notarized, bearing my name and the address of a stone cottage in a small hill town in the Umbrian region of Italy, 40 minutes from Perugia. My husband had bought it 4 years ago. He had never mentioned it once. There was a second page, a letter in his handwriting, longer than the first. "Ruth, you are wondering why I kept this from you. And I understand if you're a little angry. But I need you to hear my reasoning. 3 years ago, when our daughter and her husband came to us with that investment proposal, the one I declined, the one that caused 6 weeks of cold dinners and pointed silences, I saw something I had hoped I was imagining. I saw how they looked at our savings, not with greed. Exactly. With expectation. As if our money were a shared resource they hadn't yet been given access to. I talked to Margaret Holloway, an estate attorney I found through a colleague. She helped me restructure everything. The cottage is yours, entirely, with no mention of it anywhere in the documents our daughter or her husband have ever seen. Our retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the proceeds from selling the Lakewood property in 2019. All of it is protected in a trust that gives you complete control. We are not struggling, my love. We never were. But I needed you to be able to discover that on your own terms, not under pressure, not in the middle of grief. The cottage has a caretaker, a woman named Adriana, who lives in the village and has the spare key. I've enclosed her contact information. She speaks English. She has kept the garden for me for 4 years. She knows you're coming. I always believed you would come. All my love. Every last bit of it, forever. Your husband. I sat down on his workshop stool and cried until my chest hurt. Thursday came. I wore my good wool coat and drove to the address my husband had written in the margin of the letter. A clean brick building downtown with a simple brass plate beside the door. Margaret Holloway had a firm handshake and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the calm manner of a woman who had shepherded many people through the worst moments of their lives. She had been expecting me. She said my husband had told her I might come within the first 2 weeks. He knew me well. She walked me through everything with patience and without condescension. The trust was ironclad. The cottage was solely mine, not referenced in our joint estate documents, not visible to anyone who hadn't been told about it. Our liquid assets were substantial, far more than my daughter suspected, because my husband had quietly redirected income for years into accounts she had no knowledge of. He didn't trust her? I asked. Margaret paused carefully. He trusted her love for you. He wasn't certain about her judgment where money was concerned. He wanted to make sure you had options that couldn't be taken from you. The freedom of that word. Options. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for it until I heard it in a context that had nothing to do with basement apartments or assisted living brochures. My daughter arrived at my house Saturday morning with her husband and a printed packet of papers she'd organized into a manila folder with color-coded tabs. I noticed the color coding. She had inherited her father's methodical nature, but not his patience. They sat at my kitchen table, and she opened the folder with the brisk efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this conversation in the car. Mom, we've looked at everything. The mortgage payment, your monthly expenses, what Dad's pension actually covers. She slid a paper across the table, a budget breakdown she'd prepared herself. With her own estimates of my income, and honestly, the numbers just don't work long term. This house is too large, too expensive to maintain, and frankly, you shouldn't be alone here. I looked at the budget she had made for me without asking me a single question. She had estimated my pension income at roughly half of what it actually was. She had no line item for the investment dividends. She didn't know about the separate savings account, or the proceeds from the Lakewood property, or the trust. I see you've done a lot of work here, I said. My son-in-law leaned forward. We want to take care of you. That's all this is. We found a really lovely independent living community about 20 minutes from us. You'd have your own apartment, activities, people your age. He said people your age the way someone might say people who need guardrails on staircases. And the house? I asked. My daughter glanced at her husband before answering. We think you should sell it. The market is strong right now. We could list it by spring. And the proceeds? Another glance. We'd help you manage it. Set up an account, make sure it's properly invested. Maybe help with our mortgage, she said, this last part lightly, gliding past it since we've been carrying a lot since my husband's firm restructured. There it was. Slipped in at the end, between managed investment accounts and spring listing dates. Not a question. A plan already underway in her mind. I folded my hands on the table. Can I think about it? Mom, honestly, my daughter said, there's not a lot of time. If we're going to list by April, we need to start preparing now. Decluttering, repairs, staging. I said I'd let her know by the end of the month. She didn't like that answer, but she accepted it, which told me she believed she'd already won. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I called Margaret Holloway and told her what had been said. She confirmed what I already knew: no sale could happen without my signature. No account could be managed without my consent. I owned everything. I was accountable to no one. Then I emailed Adriana at the address my husband had written in the margin of his letter. Her reply came within an hour. It was warm and immediate, and written with the careful precision of someone who has learned English as a second language and takes it seriously. She said the cottage was in good condition. She said she had kept the garden, though the rosemary had gone a little wild. She said she was sorry about my husband, who had been a kind man and had always brought her a box of caramels from the airport. She said whenever I was ready, she would make sure the cottage was ready first. She signed it, Adriana, your neighbor already. I booked a one-way ticket to Rome for the 3rd week of December. I told no one. The weeks before I left were a quiet exercise in preparation and resolve. I contacted a property management company to look after my house. I arranged for automatic payments on all my utilities. I sorted through closets and shelves with the calm focus of someone who is editing her life down to its essentials, not because she is diminished, but because she is choosing. My daughter called twice that week. I answered once and told her I was still thinking. She told me not to take too long. I told her I appreciated her concern. We both knew the other wasn't being entirely honest. My grandson called on a Wednesday evening, out of nowhere. He was 22 and had his grandfather's voice unhurried, direct, slightly amused by the world. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom said you've been weird since the funeral." I told him I hadn't been weird. I'd been quiet. "Same thing in our family," he said. I laughed. The first real one in weeks. He asked if I needed anything. I told him what I actually needed was someone to talk to me like I was a person rather than a logistics problem. He said he was sorry he hadn't called sooner. He said he'd been told I needed space. I asked who told him that. He said his mother. "I see," I said. He asked what was really going on. I told him about his grandfather's letter, about the cottage, about the budget my daughter had prepared without asking me a single question about my actual finances. The silence on his end was long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, quietly, "They're trying to manage your money. They're trying to manage your money." I told him that appeared to be the general direction of things. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I was going to Italy. Another long silence. Then, "Good. Go. I'll cover for you as long as I can." The morning I left, I drove past my daughter's street on the way to the airport. Not to stop, just to look. Her lights were on in the kitchen window, the blue flicker of a television in the living room. Regular Tuesday morning life, entirely unaware that I was already gone. I left 3 envelopes on my kitchen table, one for my daughter, one for my son-in-law, one for my grandson, though his contained only the address of the cottage and a note that said, "Come when you're ready. There's room." The flight was long and smooth, and I slept for 5 hours somewhere over the Atlantic, which I hadn't managed in 3 weeks on solid ground. I woke up over France and looked out the window at the dark below and felt something shift in my chest. Not happiness exactly, but the precursor to it. The absence of dread. Adriana was waiting for me at the arrivals gate in Rome with a handwritten sign that had my name on it in large, clear letters. She was a small woman in her late 60s, with silver hair cut close to her head and eyes that held the particular brightness of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting. She embraced me immediately, without awkwardness, the way people do in places where warmth is not considered a vulnerability. She talked the entire drive, about the village, about the cottage, about the family 2 doors down who made their own olive oil and always left a bottle on the doorstep at Christmas, about the cafe where they knew everyone's order, about the market on Saturdays, where you could buy vegetables that still had dirt on them, which she considered the only reliable proof of freshness. She didn't ask about my grief or my children or my plans. She talked about where I was going, not where I'd been. And by the time we turned onto the hill road that wound up toward the village, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Curiosity. The cottage appeared around a curve in the road, and I understood in an instant why my husband had bought it without telling me. He knew that if I had been part of the decision, I would have called it impractical, unnecessary, indulgent. And he was right. And he was also right that I would have been wrong. It was stone and old and covered in dormant wisteria that would bloom purple in spring. The shutters were faded green. The front door was heavy wood with an iron handle. Inside, everything was low-beamed and honest terracotta floors. A fireplace. Shelves already holding a few books someone had left for guests over the years. a kitchen with a deep ceramic sink, and a window looking out over the valley below. On the kitchen table was a bottle of local wine, a jar of olive oil, a loaf of bread from the village bakery, and a handwritten note from Adriana that said simply, "Welcome home." I sat down in a chair by the window and looked at the valley until the light changed. My phone had been off since boarding. I turned it on the next morning and found 14 missed calls and 11 text messages. Most were from my daughter. 2 were from my son-in-law. 1 was from my grandson, which said only, "Good, stay there, call me when you surface." My daughter's texts began with concern, escalated to frustration, and arrived eventually at a tone I recognized from her adolescence, clipped. Accusatory, the verbal equivalent of a slammed door. "Mom, where are you? Call me. This isn't funny." The property management company called the house and I answered. "What is going on?" "We are worried sick. This is not okay." "Fine. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to just sit here and act like this is normal behavior." I read them all. I set the phone down. I made coffee in the small Italian stovetop pot I found in the cabinet and drank it at the window while the valley slowly filled with morning light. Then I called Margaret Holloway in the States to tell her where I was. She was not surprised. She said my husband had told her it might come to this. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was more than all right. She said she'd received a call from my son-in-law's attorney, asking about the status of my estate and whether my apparent departure affected my capacity to manage my own affairs. "His attorney," I repeated. She said not to be alarmed. It was a fishing expedition. There was no legal ground for anything resembling guardianship. I was in excellent health, managing my finances, and the trust documentation included 2 independent medical assessments of my cognitive capacity that my husband had arranged years ago for exactly this contingency. He had thought of everything, she said, even the things you'd hope you'd never need. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. The idea that my husband had quietly built a wall around my future while I wasn't looking not to keep me in, but to keep other things out made me feel loved in a way that had no adequate language for it. My daughter called that afternoon. I answered, "Mom." Finally, "Where on earth are you?" "Italy," I said. Silence. Then, "What?" "Tuscany." "Well, Umbria, technically. It's a region in Central. I know where Umbria is." "What are you doing there?" "I'm living here. For now." "Mom, that is not." She stopped, took a breath. She had always controlled herself in arguments the way her father controlled himself in arguments, which is to say, imperfectly, but with effort. "This is completely irrational. You don't know anyone there. You don't even speak Italian." "I'm learning," I said, which was technically true, as of approximately 36 hours ago, when Adriana had taught me to say buongiorno and grazie, and "I would like the bread, please." "Mom, we have been trying to help you, and you've disappeared. Do you understand how frightening this has been?" I thought about that. About what it meant to be frightening, and to whom, and why. I thought about the manila folder with the color-coded tabs, the independent living community 20 minutes from her house, the plan for my proceeds that had included, almost as a footnote, help with her mortgage. "I understand you've been worried," I said carefully, "but I also want to be honest with you about something. The plan you and your husband came to me with was not made with my interest at the center of it. I know you believe that it was, but the moment you included your mortgage in the same breath as my living situation, you showed me what was really being weighed." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, quietly and with an edge I knew meant she was hurt. "That's not fair." "It might not be fair," I said, "but it's true. And I think if you sit quietly with it, you'll know it's true too." She hung up. I wasn't surprised. My daughter had always needed time to process the things she couldn't immediately argue against. The next call was from my son-in-law, shorter and less controlled. He used words like erratic and concerned and perspective, and at one point the phrase, "Your daughter is devastated." which was almost certainly true but arranged as a weapon rather than an honest observation. I told him that I loved my daughter, that this was not a rejection of her, and that I had engaged a good estate attorney who could answer any legal questions he had about my affairs. He asked what that was supposed to mean. I told him it meant exactly what it sounded like. Then I went for a walk through the village with Adriana, who introduced me to the baker and the woman at the alimentari, who sold the olive oil, and two older men who played cards at the cafe every morning and accepted me into their orbit with the cheerful indifference of people who have no particular investment in your past. Adriana had lived in this village for 40 years. She had raised 3 children here, buried a husband here, built a life that needed no other setting. She walked me through the streets the way someone introduces you to old friends with affection, but without performance. "This is the piazza," she said. "On Sundays they close the street and the children ride bikes here. In summer, the church puts chairs out for the evening concerts. You will like the concerts." She said this with certainty, as if my future preferences were already known to her. I found it comforting in a way I hadn't expected. 2 weeks after I arrived, my grandson called. "Is it as good as it sounds?" he asked. "Better," I told him. He was quiet a moment. "Grandma, I have to tell you something." He told me that his mother had called a family meeting, him included, to discuss what she called Grandma's situation, by which she meant me, living abroad without asking permission. He said she had used the phrase "not thinking clearly" more than once. He said his uncle, my daughter's brother, who I hadn't mentioned yet, a reasonable and somewhat conflict-averse man who preferred not to be involved in anything, had been asked to weigh in on whether they should pursue legal options. My grandson said he had told his mother in front of everyone that if she filed a single legal document against me, he would never speak to her again. I told him that was more than he needed to do on my behalf. He said, "With respect, Grandma, it was exactly what needed to be done." I asked if his mother had responded. He said she'd cried, which was her version of losing an argument, and then the meeting had dissolved. He said he thought she was starting to understand that she wasn't going to win this one. He said he wanted to come visit if the offer was still open. I told him there was a train from Rome that stopped in the village on Thursday afternoons. He arrived on a Thursday with a backpack and a bag of pastries from a bakery near the train station that Adriana immediately inspected and approved of. He stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked at the valley below and said, "Grandpa had good taste." He did, I agreed. We spent a week together. He helped me buy a bicycle, something I hadn't done in 30 years, and accompanied me on my Italian lessons with a young woman from the village who charged very little and laughed warmly at my pronunciation without making me feel ridiculous. He met Adriana and charmed her completely and ate everything she put in front of him. He sat with me on the small terrace in the evenings and talked about his life in a way that felt genuine. Not the edited version people offer at holiday dinners, but the real version, with the uncertainties intact. On his 3rd day, he said, "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" I told him he could. "Did you know Grandpa was keeping all of this from you?" I thought about it honestly. I said I had known he was protecting things. I hadn't known the specific shape of the protection, but my husband had always been a man who handled worry quietly, who solved problems before announcing them, who believed that the most loving thing was sometimes to carry something alone rather than distribute the weight. I had trusted that quality in him for 38 years. I saw no reason to stop now. "There is no reason, super sementen." My grandson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom's not evil, you know. She's just—" "I know," I said. "I know she's not. And I love her. But love isn't the same as compliance. And I spent a lot of years confusing the two." He left on a Sunday and hugged me at the train station for a long time. A month after I arrived in Italy, I received an email from my daughter. It was formal in the way of a letter someone has drafted and redrafted and finally sent before she lost her nerve. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said on the phone, about the mortgage comment. I want to be honest with you, which I think is what you were asking for, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. You were right. When we were putting together that plan, I was thinking about more than just you. I've been stressed about our finances for 2 years, and I think I started to see your house as a solution. Not just for you. I'm not proud of that. I miss you. The kids have been asking where you are. I didn't know how to explain it to them. I told them you were on a long trip. My daughter. Grandma's not on a trip, is she? She could tell. She's 8, and she could tell. Please call me when you're ready. I'm not ready to give up on us. I read it 3 times. Then, I called Margaret Holloway to ask whether my son-in-law had taken any further legal steps. Margaret said no. She said it seemed the matter had gone quiet on that front. I wrote back to my daughter that evening. I thanked her for her honesty and told her it was the first honest thing we'd said to each other in longer than this crisis. I told her I wasn't gone forever, that my house was maintained and my ties to home were intact. I told her I didn't know how long I would stay in Italy, but that I knew I needed to be here now, and that needing something for myself did not mean I loved her less. I told her to tell the kids that Grandma was living in a stone cottage on a hill in Italy and was learning to make pasta by hand, and had recently successfully bargained in broken Italian at the Saturday market, which her grandfather would have found absolutely hilarious. Then I asked if she would come visit in spring when the wisteria bloomed. She replied within 20 minutes, "Yes, we'll come." The months that followed settled into a life I hadn't planned but recognized as mine in the way you recognize a face you've only ever seen in a dream. Adriana and I developed the rhythms of a long friendship quickly, the kind of efficiency that comes when 2 people are past the age of pretense. We walked together most mornings. We cooked together sometimes. She introduced me to her daughter, who lived in Perugia and visited on weekends with 2 small children who treated the cottage as an extension of their own lives, which I found I didn't mind at all. I began writing. Not for any audience, just to remember, to account for things, to give language to the years that had passed in the blur of loving and raising and tending to everyone else. The words came slowly at first, and then with a steadiness that surprised me. Adriana read some of it over coffee one afternoon without being asked, in that forthright Italian way, and said that I had a good voice, that I said true things. Winter gave way to an Umbrian spring that seemed designed by someone who understood what beauty was supposed to do to a person. The wisteria on the cottage facade came in exactly as promised. Cascades of it, pale, purple, and extravagant. The valley below went every shade of green. The market in the piazza overflowed with things that were in season and therefore tasted the way things were supposed to taste. My daughter arrived in April with her husband and their 2 daughters, 8 and 10, serious and curious and immediately enchanted by everything. My son-in-law shook my hand at the train station with the careful courtesy of a man who has been chastened and is trying to do better. I accepted it for what it was. My daughter hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of language. We spent 4 days together. Adriana cooked for all of us the first evening, and the children helped her roll pasta and wore too much flour and were photographed by their mother. We walked the village. We sat at the cafe where the old men played cards, and my son-in-law, who was trying, bought a round of coffees for the table and managed buon pomeriggio well enough to make everyone smile. On the last evening, my daughter and I sat on the terrace after the children were in bed. The valley was dark below us, and the sky overhead was doing something only Italian spring skies do. Perfectly clear, and so heavy with stars it seemed almost dramatized. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom, not for being worried about you, but for how I worried. For turning it into a plan before I ever asked what you needed." I told her I accepted that. She said, "Is this it? Is this your life now?" I looked at the valley. At the cottage door I'd started leaving open in the evenings to hear the night sounds. At the bicycle leaning against the stone wall and the rosemary, Adriana had cut back, so it was wild in a more intentional direction. At the book on the table beside my chair that I'd been reading for 3 weeks because I kept stopping to watch the light change. "It's my life now," I said. "At least for now. But you're part of it. You've always been part of it." She reached over and took my hand and held it, and we sat like that for a while without speaking, which is the closest our family has ever come to ease. Before they left, My 8-year-old granddaughter pulled me down to her level and said, in the serious tone she used for important announcements, "Grandma, I'm going to live here when I grow up." I told her the door would always be open. "Good," she said, "because I already told my sister, and we made a plan." I watched their taxi disappear down the hill road, and then I stood in my doorway for a while, holding both things at once, the missing them and the returning to myself. My husband had been right that I would come here. He had been right that I needed this. He had also been right, in his letter, about the thing I keep returning to, that the most loving thing sometimes is not sacrifice. It is example. My grandson called that evening to ask how the visit went. I told him it had gone well. He said he was coming back in July if the invitation was still standing. I told him Adriana had already set aside the room. I am still writing. The notebook on the kitchen table has been replaced by a second one, and now a third. What started as remembering has become something that feels like speaking to other women, maybe, who have confused their value with their usefulness, who have given so long and so fluently that they've forgotten what wanting something for themselves feels like. The shape of it, the specific weight. My husband left me a cottage on a hill in Italy because he knew I would need a place to go when the people I loved most started treating me like a balance sheet. He left me the means to go there without permission or apology. He left me the gift of arriving at 63 with something still ahead of me. I didn't know I was going to be happy here. I thought I might find peace, which seemed like a reasonable thing to hope for. But most mornings, I wake up before the light and make coffee and sit at the window while the valley comes back into itself, and I feel something I haven't had words for until recently. Alive. Not in the way of surviving, in the way of having chosen. If you've ever been in a place where the people who love you started making plans for your life without asking, or if you've ever stayed quiet to keep peace at a cost you couldn't afford, I'd love to know what you did. Drop a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We're building something here at Her Family Story, and every person who finds their way to this channel is someone I'm grateful for.